Have you ever walked into a luxurious room? Polished wood-paneled walls, a long table glowing under golden lights, only to feel like an uninvited guest? Every eye tracks your steps, not with admiration, but as if they're waiting for you to make the smallest slip, so they'll have a reason to cross your name off the list. You take your seat, begin to speak, and before you can finish, someone wearing a smile as neatly fixed as if it were glued on says, "Could you lower your voice? We're here to discuss, not to listen to a speech." The room chuckles softly as if it's a harmless joke. But you know, it's not about volume, it's about the fact they don't believe you deserve to be heard. If you've been there, you know the sting, a blade wrapped in silk. It hurts, it's smooth, and it leaves you wondering, should I stay quiet or should I speak louder? But what if instead of bowing your head, you made the whole room swallow their words? What if instead of accepting the interruption, you walked out controlling the entire game? And what if that same voice they said was too loud became the sound that echoed beyond those walls? Loud enough to change the outcome of a $100 million deal. This is the story of Vivian Cole, the woman they thought was on the defensive, but in less than an hour turned them into chess pieces moved at will, without them realizing it until the game was over. And if you've ever been in a room where every gaze is waiting for you to fail, stay, because this story will give you one reason to never lower your head again. Like and share this if you know someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the stories that might just change the way you see the world. That morning, Vivian Cole stepped into the boardroom of a powerful investment fund. Leather chairs, hot coffee, and handshakes colder than stone. They thought they already had the upper hand, but in just minutes she would show them exactly whose board they were playing on. The boardroom door eased open, revealing a long, narrow space framed in gleaming wood paneling. The conference table stretched out like a runway, and at either end sat entirely different worlds. The air was dense enough to touch, chilled as if the thermostat had been deliberately lowered a few degrees. Just to remind you, this was not a place built for comfort. Vivian Cole stepped in, her stride slow but certain. She wore a deep navy suit, subtle but just enough to stand apart from the black leather chairs encircling the table. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline below, but in here every gaze locked on her. Not in welcome, no, but in search of fault. It was the kind of scrutiny that reminded you of an airport luggage scanner, not seeking a real threat, just probing for something unusual enough to justify holding you back. Each board member had been positioned like chess pieces already in place. And at the center of that board, she was the only piece they hadn't yet decided to move. Or remove. She pulled out a chair. The scrape of its legs against the polished stone floor cut through the cultivated perfection of the room's atmosphere. A few cleared their throats. Others glanced at their papers as though too busy to care, but Vivian could see it. They were watching her, every flick of her pen, every turn of her notebook. She began to speak, her opening barely formed before a male director interrupted. His tone was smooth, polite, but sharp enough to slice. "Could you lower your voice? We're here to discuss, not to listen to a speech." A chuckle escaped from the far corner, quickly swallowed by a forced throat clear. Someone pretended to study their notes, but Vivian knew this was the moment they thought they'd found her weakness. She paused, not reacting immediately, her eyes fixed on the man who had spoken. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly, not a smile, not indifference either. The room seemed to still, no paper rustling, no pen tapping. Tilting her head just enough, she lowered her voice but sharpened it. "I thought people here cared about content, not volume." A few gave tight, awkward laughs. Others shifted in their seats as if the plush leather had suddenly grown less comfortable. Vivian swept her gaze around the table, committing each reaction to memory. This wasn't just a meeting, it was the first trial of strength, and she had just placed her opening stone on the path to being remembered. They might have believed it was an off-the-cuff retort. The truth? It was only the first touch in a chess match she had begun planning the moment she walked through the door. And they were about to find out what real volume sounded like. That chuckle from earlier, disguised under a cough, was like a small ink blot on pristine paper. Quiet, but enough to mar the whole page. Vivian let her gaze move, never lingering long on anyone, yet making each feel as though they'd been examined. It wasn't the look of someone hurt. It was the look of someone measuring, laying bricks for a counterattack. She smiled faintly and continued speaking. Her voice stayed clear, reaching everyone at the table. But before she could finish her first key point, a female director to her right raised an eyebrow. "Sorry, but the figures you just gave? They don't seem quite right." Without waiting, the woman tapped a remote and brought up a different spreadsheet. The numbers were off by only a few percent. Not enough for a serious dispute, but enough to rattle someone unsteady. A few board members exchanged glances they thought were discreet. Soft murmurs rustled the air like dry leaves stirring ahead of a storm. Vivian didn't blink. She turned a page, glanced down, and in 3 seconds saw the discrepancy. "Ah," she said, her voice calm, each word deliberate. "So there's another version of this report, the version with more typos." A quick smile, then, "But no matter, luckily I can still count past 9. Laughter, small but genuine, rose from a few. Not all, but enough to shift the atmosphere. The female director leaned back, hiding her eyes behind her file, while others began to realize Vivian wasn't the type to be nudged out of the race with a light push. She returned to her own slides, laying out growth projections with crisp clarity. Every milestone, every figure punctuated just enough to keep the room hooked. Yet beneath her words, she could feel the undercurrent. Here, every glance was a transmission. Every shrug, every sigh, signals sent to test her reaction, and she knew. When they couldn't make her stumble, they'd search for subtler, sharper ways. This room wasn't hosting just one battle, it was a series of strikes, each wrapped in courtesy. And unless you saw the next blade coming, you'd never dodge it. Vivian set her pen down. A small gesture, but her signal that she was ready. Not to defend, to strike. Leaning back, fingers loosely interlaced, her expression serene but her gaze measuring, she said once more, this time softer, more deliberate. "Oh, I thought we were here for the content, not the volume." The words dropped. Not loud, but resonant in the tightened air. Eyes met across the table. No one laughed aloud, but the silence became a mirror reflecting a few people's discomfort. An older director who'd been leaning back all along tilted forward slightly, pen stilled in his hand. He said nothing, but Vivian caught the full-length reassessment in his eyes. The female director busied herself shuffling papers, clumsy enough to betray her own awareness. Vivian's smile was subtle, a faint cover for the glint in her eyes. She turned to the next page of her presentation, voice steady as if nothing had happened. She knew exactly what she'd done. This wasn't just a comeback, it was a probe. In power games, a harmless-seeming line can be like dropping a pebble into still water. The ripples tell you where it's deep, and where it's only ankle-shallow. The perceptive ones would realize that with a single sentence, she'd marked them in her mind. Who wavered easily? Who could mask a reaction? Who tried too hard to seem detached? And now she knew exactly where to place her pieces. A younger board member, clearly less seasoned, didn't hide his intrigue. He leaned slightly to get a better view, then quickly straightened, masking it with seriousness. He, Vivian noted, might be the easiest link to draw to her side. She moved on, delivering a more critical figure, pausing just before she spoke it. Her eyes flicked toward the far end, locking briefly with the chairman's. His face was unreadable, but the way he rested his chin on his hand, gaze unwavering, told her he was revising some early assumptions. She didn't need him to say it. Knowing that underestimation was being replaced with something else was enough. Not yet respect, but no longer dismissal. Outside the windows, the city moved to its own rhythm. Inside this room, she had altered the tempo of the game. And it had all begun with a single line. They didn't know it yet, but today's match would not play out the way they imagined. The light from the projector washed over Vivian's face, painting her skin with a cool, pale blue. The rest of the room dimmed, the cityscape beyond the glass wall fading into nothing. Now there was only her, the screen, and 2 neat rows of eyes waiting for her next move. She clicked the mouse. The first slide appeared, a clean, upward-tilting graph, numbers stacked neatly like steps toward a clear goal. The faint click of the mouse echoed in the stillness, so quiet that even the soft roll of a pen at the far end of the table could be heard. Vivian drew a deep breath, not from nerves, but because she understood this kind of silence was its own form of power. Here, quiet wasn't emptiness. It was a string pulled tight, waiting for the wrong note to snap it. She began to speak. Her voice was steady, measured, never rushed. Each sentence landed exactly where it needed to, giving the room just enough time to absorb her words before she moved on. In this moment, she commanded the rhythm of the space. Every so often, light from the slides caught in someone's eyes. But most sat motionless, like carved wooden figures placed around the table. It was the kind of silence that could shake the unprepared. Vivian was not unprepared. She'd learned long ago how to stand firm in the center of a storm. The next slide came, a profit analysis. The figures were precise, almost unassailable. If she held this pace, they would have no choice but to listen, whether they wanted to or not. Then, movement on her right. The female director in the beige blazer, the one who'd chuckled earlier, leaned forward slightly toward the screen. Vivian kept speaking, but mentally marked her. In a room like this, over-attention was rarely about learning. It was about hunting for an opening. Another click. The light shifted, casting one half of Vivian's face in clarity, the other in shadow. It struck her, how perfectly it mirrored the moment. One side of her they'd already seen, the other still hidden. The silence held. But silence like this often masked the sound of someone quietly moving in for the strike. Vivian wrapped up her point and prepared to move on. She knew the first disruption wouldn't come from her. It would come from someone else. And when it did, she would be ready. The trap sprang just as she advanced to the next slide. A soft cough from her right. The beige blazer director leaned into her mic, her thin smile sharpened like it had been cut with a razor. "Sorry," she began, voice sweet but barbed, "but these figures, they seem wrong." The room tilted in her direction as though her words were the opening cue to a scene. Without waiting for permission, she clicked a remote and the slide changed. A completely different spreadsheet filled the screen. Numbers not just off by a few units, but splashed in red for emphasis. Vivian didn't glance at the screen right away. Instead, she looked directly at the woman, as if weighing whether to answer gently or decisively. A low hum of whispers spread around the table. Chairs shifted. Pens tapped against wood. Papers rustled. A chorus of doubt. For many presenters, this would have been the most humiliating moment of the meeting. Vivian didn't rush, and that unhurriedness alone unsettled a few people. She rolled her pen between her fingers, then turned to the screen. Her eyes swept the numbers in seconds. She didn't just see the discrepancy, she saw the clumsy intent behind it. "Ah," she said at last, voice slow, almost conversational. "So this is another version of the report, the version with more typos." She let the last two words land and a few people chuckled. Not the whole room, but the right corners, the corners that mattered. "No problem," she continued. "Good thing I can still count past 9. Another ripple of laughter, less restrained this time. The woman in beige stayed upright, but her lips pressed into a thinner line. Clearly, she hadn't expected her little snare to be dismantled so neatly, and certainly not without breaking the flow of the presentation. Vivian switched back to her own slides, her tone unchanged, her delivery unbroken. But in her mind, she'd already logged her opponent's name and face. This wouldn't be the last strike. The whispers died out, replaced by a new kind of quiet. The kind that came when people realized they'd have to be far more careful if they wanted to trip her up. And while they were busy recalculating, Vivian began setting her own trap. She paused for just a beat, tilting her head toward the screen once more. "Good thing I can still count past 9, she repeated softly, almost as an aside, but clear enough for everyone to hear. A few awkward laughs broke the air, not the laughter of amusement, but of surprise from people caught off guard. Enough to fracture the tension, but not enough to mask the colder faces across the table. The beige blazer director didn't respond. She leaned back, tapping her pen against the table's edge, perhaps convincing herself this was only a minor setback. But Vivian recognized the look beneath that surface calm, the irritation of someone who had just lost control of the board. Vivian clicked forward with purpose, as though shutting a door. The screen's cool light shifted again over her features, and she spoke as if the interruption had been nothing more than a side note. In truth, she was doing much more. She was studying every reaction. The older director in the far left corner inhaling slowly, the younger member hiding a smile behind his hand, the chairman still resting his chin in his palm, but with eyes no longer glazed in disinterest. She knew now, sometimes victory in a room didn't mean toppling the biggest player. It meant making everyone else see you weren't someone who could be quietly pushed aside. And with one line, she'd made them rethink their whole approach. Vivian ended with her final slide, leaving the potential profit figure glowing, not as a promise, but as proof. She wasn't chasing their approval. She wanted them to leave with the uneasy thought that maybe they'd misjudged her from the start. No one spoke. No one interrupted. But in the stillness, she knew the undercurrent remained. A failed strike didn't mean the attacker was done. Her lips curved slightly as she set down her pen. To her, this wasn't the conclusion of the game. It was the blink before the next round began. And next time, the attack wouldn't come from just one direction. The boardroom door eased open, letting in a young assistant. He moved so quietly it was almost soundless, yet his presence was like a hairline crack in the glass tension of the room. He bent toward the chairman, whispering just for him, words too faint for anyone else to catch. But the effect wasn't subtle. The chairman's gaze shifted instantly from the papers in front of him to Vivian. No blink, no smile. Just a sharp, unwavering study, as if reevaluating the very reason she was sitting there. Vivian felt the weight of that look, but didn't lift her head right away. She kept writing in her notebook, slow, even strokes, as if nothing had changed. Inside, though, she marked it as an anomaly worth remembering. In less than a minute, the room's energy shifted. A board member at the far end lowered his eyes to the table, his right hand sliding discreetly beneath the polished wood toward a glowing phone. His thumb moved in quick, furtive strokes, not taking notes, but typing. She didn't need to read the words. She knew the rhythm. She'd seen it in dozens of meetings where information traveled faster than the agenda on the screen. Whatever message was being passed, it wasn't harmless. Not if it could make the chairman's attitude change so abruptly. When she finally glanced up, a soft vibration hummed from another corner of the table. A different member checked his phone, then looked at the person beside him. Just a 1-second glance, but it carried the unspoken signal. We've got something worth noting. Vivian's face stayed composed, but her mind was already threading the pieces together. Mid-meeting messages weren't for congratulations. They were invisible knives, dangerous because you didn't know where they'd come from or when they'd strike. She shut her notebook gently, laying the pen across the page as if pausing for a break. In truth, she wanted them to see she wasn't too busy to notice the shift around her. The young assistant had already slipped out, but his brief entrance lingered. In the chairman's eyes, in the busy fingers under the table, in the way the whole room had gone unnaturally still, as if waiting for her to react. Vivian knew this wasn't a passing moment. It was the opening move of something more calculated, wrapped in polished manners. And if this was the first invisible cut, the next would aim for whatever weakness they thought she was hiding. The next wave of phone vibrations came not sporadically, but in a ripple around the table. Screens lit faces trying to look indifferent, but failing to mask the slight, eager smirks of people who believed they'd just been handed a sharpened blade. The message was short, perfect for planting doubt. Vivian once botched a similar deal. Lost millions. No proof, no citation, just a stain thrown at her record. In rooms like this, rumor was its own currency. It didn't have to be true, only useful. She caught a few stolen glances. Some were smug, but she paid more attention to the ones who stayed too quiet, as if waiting to see whether she would defend herself, or let the rumor define her. Then came the question. Sharp, aimed to pierce without breaking the veneer of civility. Have you learned from the last time? It came from a male director near the end of the table, his voice coated with politeness, thin enough for everyone to hear the bite beneath. He leaned back, fingers laced, eyes probing for a flinch or a dodge. Vivian set down her pen and looked directly at him. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for an outburst or a rushed defense. Anything to confirm they'd struck a nerve. She gave them neither. Instead, she let the silence hang, long enough for impatience to creep in. Then, with a slight tilt of her head and a faint curl at the corner of her mouth, she said, "Oh, so we're telling ghost stories now?" "By all means, finish yours." A few laughs broke out, not from her detractors, but from corners of the table that mattered more. The director's smirk faltered, his gaze sliding away. Vivian kept her eyes on him, fastening her words into the room's memory. She knew she'd unsettled them. When you refuse the role of victim, their carefully built script collapses. Still, she understood a clever retort wouldn't end this game. Rumors once loose always found a way back, often with a sharper edge. She closed her notebook with deliberate slowness, as though wrapping a gift rather than ending a discussion. Her fingers rested lightly on the cover before she repeated, clearly and evenly, "Oh, heck, so we're telling ghost stories now? By all means, finish yours." The line fell into the room like a drop of ink into clear water. No one laughed this time. No coughs, no pen taps. Even the cold glow from the screen behind her seemed to fade, letting the quiet expand. The director who'd spoken pressed his lips together, started to reply, then thought better of it. He spun his pen, eyes searching his notes as if something more urgent had claimed his attention. Vivian recognized the shift, the pause of an attacker who'd just lost their rhythm. A few chairs shifted subtly, small adjustments signaling a recalibration in attitude. Not physical distance, but something less tangible. In this world, silence could be the closest thing to admitting you'd misjudged someone. Vivian didn't smile in victory. She leaned forward as though inviting everyone back to business. But her eyes, steady, lit with quiet force, held the weight of the moment. She clicked to the next slide, her voice smooth again, each word placed like a deliberate chess move. Both to keep her presentation flowing and to remind them she still set the pace here. She wasn't naive. This failed strike wouldn't make them retreat. If anything, it would push them to find a subtler, more unexpected opening. The room found its rhythm again, but it wasn't the same. Now their gazes carried a mix of curiosity, caution, and the reluctant recognition that she wasn't as easy to move as they'd thought. Vivian turned a fresh page, her pen strokes sharp, almost carved into the paper. She wrote quickly, not notes for them, but a reminder to herself. Hold the rhythm. Don't let them decide the next moment. Because on this board, you don't win with the flashiest move. You win by knowing when to keep still and let your opponent make the next mistake. And if they thought her last counter was the end, they'd soon learn it was only the opening line of another chapter. The faint squeak of a hinge broke through the low hum of the boardroom. The door opened just a sliver, barely enough to draw notice. Most eyes stayed locked on the glowing screen, on the shifting numbers clicking forward with each mouse tap. But Vivian heard it. From that narrow gap, a short burst of laughter spilled in. It was unmistakable, low, rough, carrying the clipped cadence of someone far too used to commanding a room into silence before speaking. Then came the voice, clear even through the partial barrier. If they hesitate by even a step, we'll sign immediately. Vivian didn't need to look to know who it was. That voice belonged to her greatest rival in the industry. The one who'd spent years undermining her deals, even bribing partners just to derail agreements on the brink of closing. The door closed again as if nothing had happened. But the air inside shifted. The thick wood-paneled walls suddenly felt closer, the warm overhead lighting tighter. The room seemed smaller, the seating closer, the long table now a trench dividing two clear sides. Vivian stayed still, but her spine was just a fraction straighter. She caught quick glances traded between a few members, as though they'd already known who was outside. One director tilted his head just enough to peek before the door shut, then turned back with a smile too sharp to be friendly. She didn't need confirmation. Her rival hadn't shown up here by chance. He'd been invited, or at least allowed Nenya to stand just beyond that door, waiting to be pulled in. And letting her hear his laugh wasn't an accident. It was a message. You're not the only option we're considering. Vivian's gaze swept the table. Everyone tried to keep their faces neutral, but that uniform restraint betrayed its own collusion. She knew some games were never played in the open, and some pieces were placed before you even stepped into the room. Outside, the click of shoes on the hallway floor faded, but their echo stayed. Not the sound itself, but the presence it implied. Of a third player waiting for an opening, a shadow just behind you while you're looking ahead. Vivian drew a slow, measured breath, each inhale building a wall against any rushed reaction. In matches like this, the first one to show unease becomes the prey. What they didn't know was that she'd played against hands hidden far deeper in the dark. And when the shadows seemed to shield someone, they could just as easily conceal her own counterstrike. The next time that door opened, she thought, the person walking in might not be the ally they were expecting. The silence stretched a few beats longer, as if the room itself was deciding who would take the next swing. Then a voice cut through, blunt and unsweetened. They're in the next room, and they're ready to replace you. Immediately. The last word landed heavy, a clear announcement of a plan already in motion. It wasn't a veiled threat, and it was an open declaration. The speaker, a director whose eyes never left Vivian's, seemed to be measuring her every twitch. She heard every word, but didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her posture so at ease it risked irritating the person across from her. Her gaze held steady on him, not with open challenge, but with the cool focus of someone cataloging behavior in a lab experiment. To most, that statement would be a blade to the ribs, forcing you to prove your worth or be cut out on the spot. But Vivian knew direct stabs revealed more than they should. Impatience, overconfidence in the strike, and too much faith in its inevitability. She set her pen on the table, spinning it lightly between her fingers. Interesting, she said, voice steady and low. People usually don't introduce the backup before the first choice fails, unless they never wanted the first choice to succeed. Several eyes shifted instantly, away from her and toward others at the table, scanning for reactions. A member down at the far end frowned. Another adjusted his tie a little too deliberately to be natural. The director who'd spoken pressed his lips together but stayed silent. He leaned back, eyes narrowing as though trying to decode her angle. The air thickened again, but not because she'd been cornered. She'd pulled everyone else into the awkward spotlight. In power plays, when someone mentions the replacement to your face, they're also unintentionally revealing a piece of the plan they meant to keep hidden. Vivian tapped the clicker, shifting the slide. The light from the screen washed across her face, catching the faintest curve of a private smile. Every blunt comment today was just another puzzle piece for her to place. And once the picture was complete, there would be no safe distance left for anyone to watch from. The fourth strike had come. But not every hit left her bleeding. Some just made her hone her own blade sharper. She didn't waste a second reacting the way they wanted. No frown, no forced smile, no defensive retort. Just a single nod, quick and final, as if she'd been given a weather update. Good, she said evenly. Competition keeps things healthy. The room froze for half a beat. Some waited for her to elaborate or challenge the claim. She gave them nothing. Instead, she turned her notebook toward herself, clicked her pen, and wrote a single unhurried line. Like signing a contract no one else was allowed to read. A few eyes dropped to the table. Others pretended to study their papers. But the silence no longer belonged to them. It was hers now. When someone absorbs a hit designed to weaken them and stays steady, the quiet becomes harder to endure than any rebuttal. Vivian lifted her gaze, letting it rest on each face in turn. She wasn't rushing and she wasn't avoiding anyone. But in the corner of her eyes there was a glint. The kind that makes people shift in their seats, straighten their backs, or clasp their hands tighter. Not anger, but the look of someone who already sees the next move and knows exactly when to make it. A senior director who'd been silent all morning cleared his throat and switched the cross of his legs. He avoided her eyes, but not fast enough to hide the unease. In this game, even small ticks told her who was afraid of what. She returned to the screen, advanced the slide, and spoke as if nothing notable had happened. Yet every word now carried a slower, sharper cadence, each figure and forecast placed with the weight of an unspoken truth. I know where I stand, and I know what you're doing. Those hoping she'd lose her footing were beginning to realize they'd just handed her an edge. The news of her rival in the next room hadn't distracted her. It had drawn a map of the battlefield, showing her exactly where the enemy stood, and who in this room had opened the door for him. By the time the final slide appeared, Vivian closed her pen and set it flush with the edge of her notebook. She didn't need to look around to know some were unsettled that the control had shifted. Because in power, the most dangerous player isn't the one who strikes hardest. It's the one who smiles at the blow, while readying a move that can turn the whole board over. And for Vivian, this board had only just started to spin. Vivian closed the file in front of her, her voice as calm as if she'd just suggested something entirely harmless. I'd like to take 5 minutes. No one objected, but neither did anyone show generosity. A few slow nods, a handful of eyes following her as she rose, as if memorizing each step she took toward the door. The door shut behind her, and the noise of the boardroom vanished. Outside, the carpeted hallway was so still her heels sounded like a clock ticking. Warm yellow light spilled across the path, giving it the feel of a side stage. Less dramatic to the outside world, but still where the real ending was decided. She stopped midway down the hall, resting her back lightly against the wood-paneled wall. She drew a deep breath, not from fatigue, but to reset her pulse. In her mind, the morning's fragments began to fit together. The interruptions, the swapped data, the rumors that spread faster than her slides, and her rival's sudden appearance just outside the room. Together they formed one picture. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a siege, and she was in the center. Vivian opened her bag and pulled out her phone. No scrolling, no searching, and just one tap on the first name in her priority list. This wasn't a call to vent or seek comfort. It was a move to shift the board. Her fingers moved with care, slow enough to avoid misdialing, fast enough to remind herself that time was the only thing in short supply. The hallway's golden light caught on her screen, splitting her reflection into two halves. One watchful, one ready to strike. She pressed the phone to her ear, and when the line connected, her voice was clipped, leaving no room for interruption. Within seconds, the message was delivered. No lengthy setup, no polite qualifiers. Just instructions. And the unspoken understanding that there was no alternative but to act. Vivian ended the call, holding the phone to her ear for one beat longer, savoring the silence before stepping back into the fray. She slipped it into her bag, straightened her jacket, and headed for the boardroom door. She knew the eyes inside would be waiting to see her stumble. What they didn't know was that this pause hadn't been for rest. It had been to ready her hands on the table's edge, prepared to spin the board itself. And when that board turned, not every piece would still be where they had left it. Inside, the door stayed shut, but the quiet wasn't stillness. Low voices hummed between those seated close enough to lean in. "She's probably done," a man near the end of the table said, half observation, half wish. He leaned back, arms folded, gaze on the ceiling like he'd confirmed a long-held prediction. Another voice, softer but sharper, cut in. "No," probably calling her lawyer, planning a clean exit. Scattered nods followed, the scenario settling in as the likeliest truth. In rooms like this, no one needed facts, just a story palatable enough to swallow. The chairman said nothing, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the table as though counting down to the next move. A few members glanced toward the door, their eyes mixing curiosity with impatience. Unspoken, most were wondering if the woman they'd been testing all morning would even come back. At one corner, a director in a beige blazer lowered her gaze to her notes, the faintest curve tugging at her mouth. She didn't have to say a word to show she believed the outcome was already settled. Speculation here wasn't filler, It was reinforcement. Every jab since morning had been working toward the same end. And when your opponent leaves the table, even briefly, the gap fills with the version of the story you most want to believe. A younger director, silent until now, spoke up. If she's back with a lawyer, we lose another hour. If she's not back, we should just bring the guy outside in now. That line dropped like a match on embers. A few nodded harder. Others began arranging their papers, ready for an entirely different meeting. What they didn't know was that Vivian wasn't leaning against the wall, letting the clock run. She had already made her call, and all that was left was to pick her moment. While they were writing the script of her exit, she was preparing to re-enter as the one holding the casting list. When the moment came, it wouldn't follow anyone else's script. Vivian's voice on the call had been low, steady, and stripped of anything but intent. We sign now, exclusive, no conditions. The last 4 words dropped like weighted stones. Not to echo, but to cement a decision that couldn't be walked back. The reply came in one clean syllable. Understood. The call ended without another word. She lowered her hand, keeping the phone in her palm a beat longer than needed, feeling the weight of a move placed on the board. Not to salvage a position, but to flip it. Phone in her bag, spine straight, she walked back toward the door. Each step on the carpet was a measured count toward a moment only she knew was coming. She pushed the door open. The air inside hadn't shifted. Same faces in a ring, same warm light on the polished wood. But Vivian caught the subtle lean of bodies toward each other, the posture of people who'd been trading lines. She ignored the darting glances and tight mouths, walking straight to her seat and sliding in as though she'd been gone seconds, not long enough to rewrite the game. Sorry to keep you waiting, she said, her voice level, free of even a hint of apology. It was less an excuse than a quiet sting, a reminder that in the time they'd been idling, their only work had been guessing about her. Some traded looks as if checking whether she'd brought something new back. The chairman's eyes lingered a moment longer, his hand still at the edge of his papers. Vivian opened her notebook and clicked her pen. Every motion was so ordinary it bordered on dull, and that in itself unsettled them. They were used to seeing opponents return showing strain, quicker breath, tighter voice, a rehearsed reason for their absence. She showed none of it. What they didn't know was that outside a deal had been locked beyond reversal. If her plan held, news of it would reach them before the meeting closed. She lifted her eyes, letting them pass over each face, quietly counting the players still in this game. She knew her move had shifted the ground, but also knew it wasn't yet time to turn over every card. Sometimes the thing that worries your opponent most isn't the blow itself, but not knowing when it will land. The atmosphere in the boardroom stayed locked in a state of waiting. Every gaze was fixed on Vivian, not to listen, but to watch. Watch for the moment she might bend. A few leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, lips curved ever so slightly as if anticipating her concession. Others poised their pens, ready to note her capitulation and sign the pre-written terms. The chairman remained perfectly still, chin resting on one hand, the other draped loosely over a stack of documents. He didn't speak. It was as if he preferred the space to carry itself toward a moment he believed would belong to him. Vivian sat upright, flipped a page in her notes, her expression unchanged. The waiting was like a windless lull at sea. Everyone knew it would shift, but no one could say when. Then the first sound broke the stillness, not from her, but from the vibration of a phone. A young director at the far end glanced down. In seconds, his face shifted from neutral to stunned. He looked up, met a colleague's eyes briefly, then set his phone down without flipping it face down as usual. Moments later, another vibration. This time from the woman in the beige blazer. She checked her screen, eyes widening before she quickly composed herself. Vivian caught it. That flicker couldn't be hidden. A third, a fourth vibration, like a ripple of signals spreading through the room. The silence that followed wasn't the earlier expectant pause. It was a stillness threaded with surprise and unease. At last, the chairman's phone chimed. He read the message, and for the first time that morning, his composure slipped. His eyes froze mid-scan, finger hovering as if unsure whether to scroll or reread. On the screen, a priority email from Vivian's fiercest competitor. Exclusive contract signed with Vivian Cole, effective immediately. No conditions, no qualifiers, just a concise announcement. Enough to erase every assumption they'd been nursing since the start of the meeting. Vivian didn't need to peek at anyone's device to know. She had authored the moment, and now it was doing its work, turning the wind. She stayed still, hands clasped on the table, not waiting for a reaction but for each mind to grasp when the board had turned beneath them. And when the wind changes, sails, once full, will find themselves pushing against it. The chairman's mask of calm, honed over decades in business, showed its first crack. A cautious director beside him set his pen down with a dry click, as if punctuating the end of a plan. His other hand disappeared under the table, tapping urgently at his phone, movements far too rapid for casual messaging. Vivian saw it all without turning her head. From the corner of her eye, she watched the ripple travel the length of the table. No more whispers, no smirks or conspiratorial glances, just the stillness of people realizing their winning card was no longer in their hand. The beige blazer director sat straighter, but her gaze slid away from Vivian toward others, quietly scanning for a new alignment. Her earlier confidence had thinned into something measured, even guarded. The chairman kept his phone close, one fingertip resting on its edge as though unwilling to lose hold of the feed. He inhaled slowly, deliberately, then leveled his eyes at Vivian. The weight in the room wasn't from brewing debate. It was from the shared understanding that the story had changed. That email wasn't just a deal, it was proof the playing field was no longer theirs alone. Vivian held her silence. Words now would only dilute what stillness was already accomplishing. That stillness was the mark each person here would etch into memory. No one smiled anymore. Faces once brimming with calculation shifted into wariness. A few leaned back, some crossed arms tighter, but none moved to leave. They needed time to process how it had happened, and how so fast. She picked up her pen and wrote a short line, not for them to see, but as a private reminder. When the wind shifts, don't swim with it. Let it carry your ship farther. And right now, her ship was cutting ahead faster than anyone here would admit. Vivian reached for her glass, her pace unhurried, as if the room's clock ticked to her rhythm. She turned the glass in her palm, catching the light in small, dancing glints, then sipped as though at her favorite cafe, not the eye of a meeting that had just flipped. The only sound was the faint clink of ice against glass. In a room once noisy with interruptions, jabs, and sly laughs, this silence carried far more weight. She set the glass down, sweeping her eyes over each face, not in challenge, not in triumph, but with the calm of someone holding the wheel and knowing there's no rush to prove it. The chairman's hand had left his phone. Others avoided her gaze entirely, curling inward into their own safe corners. Even the beige blazer instigator kept her eyes on her page, circling meaningless loops in the margin. Vivian knew their thoughts. How to pivot when the threat you hope to leverage is now your opponent's strategic ally. The exclusive contract hadn't just closed a door, it had locked every back entrance they might have used. She didn't need to say it. In this world, victory often came from letting others fill in the blanks, and this blank was glaring. She flipped to a fresh page, the rustle sharp enough to make a few flinch. She jotted numbers, keywords, underlined a phrase. None knew what she wrote, and that uncertainty itself was a pressure. An older director at the far end tilted his head, curiosity flickering but stopped short of speaking. No one wanted to be the one to reopen the field they'd just lost. Vivian set her pen down, leaned back, and smiled. An ambiguous gesture as unclaimed as it was unsettling. She lifted her glass again, a subtle signal that she had time to savor every moment. Because in battles like this, what keeps an opponent awake at night isn't always the blow you land, but the ease with which you seem to breathe afterward. Vivian eased her chair back, the faint scrape against the floor, just enough to draw every eye toward her. No one spoke, but the silence now was nothing like the pauses before. This was not silence to listen, it was silence to speculate. Would she leave the table with an ellipsis? Or a full stop? She began gathering her papers. Each movement was deliberate, every sheet stacked neatly, every folder folded shut with care. It was the precision of clearing a table after a meal, not the frantic gathering of weapons after a battle. Across the table, pages rustled, dry and quick. A director feigned reviewing a report, though it was clearly a shield from her gaze. Another lifted a pen only to set it down again, the small, unnecessary sound becoming the lone disruption in the room. The chairman sat motionless, hands laced before him. His eyes never left Vivian, but the power they once carried had shifted. Now it was the cautious recognition given to an opponent one must concede has won this round. Vivian zipped her bag, slid the folders inside, then stood. Her posture was so steady the room seemed to narrow around her. Her glance skimmed the row of seats, not lingering on anyone long enough to challenge them, yet making each person certain her eyes had passed over them. No one volunteered a word. They sat in stillness, as if any sentence uttered now would be remembered, analyzed, and used to define their position after this meeting. Those who had been loudest in the morning were now those with heads bowed. Vivian did not rush. She let the slowness stretch, letting the gap between her final action and her first step toward the door become long enough for them to wonder. Would she speak before leaving? In the thick stillness, the ticking of the wall clock grew louder, each second counting down to a moment they all knew was coming. The moment she would break the silence. But if they expected thanks or polite closure, they had forgotten who Vivian Cole was. Her final words would not merely signal her exit. They would etch themselves into the memory of everyone present. The chairman leaned forward slightly, fingers interlaced on the table, trying to hold a composure he knew was cracking. The corner of his mouth twitched into a strained smile, the kind too weak to mask the truth beneath. "Vivian," he began, but the sentence fell apart in the air. His voice didn't shake, but it lacked the confidence it once carried. The hesitation was that of a man searching for words to salvage pride, yet knowing any would backfire. He glanced at the documents before him, then up at her, their eyes meeting for a fleeting second before he looked away. Around the table, no one broke the absolute quiet. No throat clearing, no pens tapping. The room felt like a stage after the curtain had fallen, with the audience still frozen in their seats. Vivian stood still, one hand resting lightly on her bag strap, the other relaxed at her side, her gaze sweeping the table. She didn't need words to assert control. Her prolonged silence and stance did it for her. They all knew, themselves most of all, that the game was over. Not by explosion or dramatic clash, but by silent moves stacked through the morning, ending with a turn of the board no one foresaw. The beige blazer director who had interrupted the most now stared down at her notes, her pen unmoving. An older director leaned back with eyes half closed, as if cutting himself off from the tightening air. Unspoken, but understood, they had removed themselves from the game. The moment they let their opponent take the role of decider, their plans had lost all weight. Vivian's gaze was free of gloating. She had no need for that kind of victory. This moment mattered more than any applause, the moment when adversaries understood their loss without being told. The chairman drew a deep breath, ready to speak again, but her eyes halted him. Not angry, but carrying the truth that any explanation now would be wasted. She lifted her bag, and in that instant, no one moved. The room was locked, waiting for her final words. Words they would remember longer than any clause they'd discussed. Vivian paused just before leaving, hands loose but eyes intent. She turned back to the table, meeting every gaze. Not hurried, not harsh, but slow and focused enough to make each feel as if she'd seen to the bottom of their thoughts. "It seems my voice," she began, her tone steady yet resonant, "is loud enough to carry beyond this room." The last words slid into the air, quiet but heavy, like a coin dropping into the depths of a well, taking seconds to land where their meaning would hit. Not boast, not farewell. A power statement wrapped in calm, one that irritated and silenced in equal measure. An older director wet his lips, perhaps to break the spell, but too late. Vivian had already turned. The click of her heels marked each step, crisp and deliberate. Behind her, the room stayed frozen. A few exchanged glances, checking whether others felt the sting to their collective pride. The beige blazer woman stared at the table, pen idle, her mask of composure gone. Vivian didn't look back. Each step was a bold line under the conclusion of this meeting. She needed nothing but the prepared files and the knowledge she was leaving not in defense, but as the one who had placed the final piece. The door opened, spilling bright hallway light into the dimmer room, making the air inside feel heavier. As she crossed the threshold, those left behind seemed trapped in a space no longer under their command. The door's dry click as it closed behind her was a simple sound, but it carried the weight of a lock turning on a match just ended. Outside, the hall was as bright and calm as before. But Vivian knew inside, the silence would last longer than they expected. Because the hardest thing for those used to imposing control is realizing they no longer decide how the story will be told. And with her final words, Vivian left not just with victory, but with a void no justification could fill. Because some sounds, once they leave the room, keep traveling, reaching places no one imagined they would. The next morning, the economic headlines flooded shelves and digital screens alike. Vivian Cole signs billion-dollar deal, defeats rival in 20 minutes. The photo showed her shaking hands with the CEO of the partner corporation, her smile warm enough to signal cooperation, yet cool enough to suggest that behind it lay a match already decided. The boardroom building where yesterday's meeting had taken place was unusually quiet. In each executive's office, the sound of newspapers rustling and computer mice clicking on news links formed a shared background score. No one had to ask if the others had read it. Everyone knew they had, and everyone knew exactly what they were swallowing. The chairman sat at his wooden desk, the news headline displayed on his large screen. He didn't reread the story. His eyes stayed fixed on the number in the headline. Billion. The word sliced through months of assumptions, plans, and strategies like a thin blade. In another office, the beige blazer director turned the page slowly, her finger tracing each word. Every sentence was a reminder of her failed attempt to undermine Vivian. The faint smile she had worn through yesterday's meeting had vanished, replaced by a distant stare as she tried to explain it to herself. A few other board members pretended to be buried in paperwork, but their eyes kept drifting to their phone screens with each new notification. Social media comments poured in, from investors to outsiders, most praising Vivian's boldness. The most shared remark read, 20 minutes is all it takes to change the outcome of a deal, if you know how to make the boardroom your home turf. The sting wasn't just in losing, it was in losing so fast there was no time to react. They had been there, witnessed it all, and still couldn't stop it. The kind of defeat that leaves you not only angry, but ashamed. Outside the building, reporters gathered, hoping someone from the board would comment. No one came out. They chose to shut their doors, not because they didn't want to speak, but because they had nothing to say that could salvage their image. Vivian, elsewhere in the city, didn't rush to give interviews. She let the story spread on its own like a wave that didn't need her to push it. She knew silence now wasn't just humility. It was a way to let the echo of her victory last longer. And with every headline shared, the aftershocks from yesterday's meeting rippled, not only through the board, but into other power rooms where her name was now spoken with a new tone. The news didn't stay confined to the front pages. Inside the board's building, internal emails began arriving with short, cold subject lines. Personnel changes, effective immediately. Some board members, those who had led the charge against Vivian, were summoned upstairs. The chairman's office door shut, and when they emerged, their faces told the story. They had been asked to resign. No fanfare, no ceremony, just a cleansing decision. The once busy hallways fell silent. Each time a door opened, eyes turned, curious yet too cautious to ask. Everyone knew that leaving the board now wasn't voluntary. It was fallout from yesterday's disaster meeting. That phrase, disaster meeting, began to circulate like finance world folklore. From whispers in the ground floor cafe to after-work bar conversations, everyone had their own version. Some recounted it with such detail you'd think they were in the room. others added flair. But all agreed on one thing. It was the day the board had shot itself in the foot. Rumors traveled beyond the company faster than expected. Investors, partners, even competitors heard about Vivian's reversal of fortune. The story spread not just as a corporate anecdote, but as a warning. On the power chessboard, never give someone the chance to flip the game in front of you. A respected financial outlet published a long analysis, naming no one but Vivian. Yet the details made it clear to anyone in the industry who the others were. The piece ended with, "If this board were a ship, yesterday they opened the floodgates themselves." And Vivian Cole simply stood by as the water swept away everything in her path. In employee group chats, jokes about empty seats on the board began. Someone even made a meme, reserved for those who think they can't be replaced. Those involved directly stayed silent, but their silence was proof enough. They no longer had a position to defend. Vivian didn't step into any of the chatter. She let the story grow on its own, like a fire that needed no fuel but the wind blown by those who once tried to extinguish it. And when the flames reached other rooms, they'd burn more than just the board's chairs. The finance world waited for an official move from Vivian Cole. The press called, emailed, even sent questions through mutual contacts. Morning talk shows wanted her to share leadership lessons. Every request got the same reply: no comment. Then one afternoon, while the rumors were still hot and articles kept appearing by the hour, Vivian updated her personal page. No long post, no analysis, no justification. Just a short line, ending with a period like a quiet but resounding knock. Don't mistake volume for value. 7 words. And the internet exploded. People debated whether she was referring to yesterday's meeting or speaking on a broader principle of leadership. Some argued it was a subtle rebuttal to the "you're too loud" comment from day one. Others saw it as a message to anyone who had underestimated her, that a strong voice doesn't equal emptiness. On investment forums, the phrase became the title for numerous negotiation strategy threads. Experts called it the art of winning without shouting, a strength only those who know their worth possess. Interestingly, Vivian didn't respond to any comment, praise, or criticism. She let the words stand, spread, and attach themselves to her image as a new brand. For those who had followed the story from the start, that line didn't just close a chapter, it opened a door. If she could turn the tables this quickly, how many more disaster meetings awaited those who dared to challenge her? Market analysts put it more bluntly. This isn't her final win, this is just the warm-up. And in a cafe near the financial district, a group of young employees whispered, "She didn't just win the deal. She's building a story everyone wants to hear the next part of." Meanwhile, in a quiet room, Vivian sat by the window, watching the city lights come on. Her phone still buzzed with notifications, but she didn't reach for it. This battle was done, and she knew many others awaited. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't in the applause right after the curtain falls, but in the certainty the audience will come back for the next act. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.